Here we go. Okay, well, that's the first slide. So I'm going to talk about, touch on some stuff around redistricting and gerrymandering. I'll show these links again at the end. I have a bunch more stuff in a Google Doc, and I'll have a link to this slideshow as well as our own website that we've built around redistricting resources and showing off some of the work that we've done in the past. So I'm a GIS analyst at Azavia. We're a geospatial software and data analytics company based in Philly, and we've done some work around redistricting, been involved in some court cases around gerrymandering analysis. We've also built some open source districting software called District Builder, which we want everyone to get involved in. We're currently in the process of revamping that right now. Can you raise your hand if you know what this is? Wow, okay, so quite a few people. So it's actually two things. There are two correct answers. It's Pennsylvania's former 7th congressional district, and also Goofy Kicking Donald Duck, which is sort of the name that was given to it because I guess, I don't know, it kind of looks like that. I didn't really see it until I saw the cartoon, but okay, I get it. And so this was sort of the poster child of gerrymandering. This violated all of the criteria you can think of. And this district was successfully overturned in a court case in Pennsylvania at the Pennsylvania Supreme Court level, which is really exciting. So it's gone. We don't have to look at that anymore. I want to actually go back and talk about some American history. The 1960s, obviously a very pivotal time in American history. And why do we redistrict all the time? Why is it happening? So it happens every 10 years, as we all know, but it didn't always happen that way. So this first case, Baker v. Carr, this guy, Charles Baker in Tennessee, he lived in Shelby County, which is where Memphis is. Memphis was growing, urban areas were growing, and Tennessee had not redistricted for 60 years. So for 60 years, the districts were exactly the same. Many other states were like this. He argued that this was a debasement of his vote, that rural areas had more power and more weight, their vote had more weight than his did. And so Tennessee redistricted. And so if you see the 9th district there in the southwestern corner of the state, it got a lot smaller. And so now Shelby County had 3 districts in it instead of just 1. And this set off a chain of other Supreme Court cases that really changed the landscape of redistricting. We ended up with the sort of established sort of philosophy that we have around one person, one vote, and then at the congressional and state legislative level. And by 1964, we sort of have established that all states must redistrict after every decennial census, and all the districts have to be approximately equal population. Believe it or not, that wasn't a thing for a long time. So what happened? Obviously, every state had challenges to their districts, and so they were all like, okay, I guess we got to do something about that. And so every state redistricted. 46 states that needed to redistrict their congressional districts redistricted, and that was a big moment. It also set into line this sort of timeline that we have after every decennial census. We have all the years ending in 1, where the states get redistricting data from the U.S. Census Bureau, and then they begin that process of redistricting. So how did this happen? So in the 1970s was the first sort of decade that all this had to happen all over again. And we didn't really have, computers weren't really used for redistricting back then, so it was all done on paper and pencil with adding machines. I really looked for photos of this and I just couldn't find it, but I read a lot about like descriptions of, sweaty, smoke-filled rooms and the basements of state legislatures where staffers and politicians are there's just maps all over the walls and they're drawing and they're using adding machines to, try to get these districts of equal population. It was really challenging. It was really hard for states to do this, so they lobbied the Congress to pass a law requiring the Census Bureau to produce data at alternative geographies like voting precincts. So that's the most granular geography that we vote at. That's generally how districts are drawn at that level, although I guess congressional districts are drawn at the block level these days. But those voting precincts, we now have every 10 years a new data set of voting precincts that comes out with population data, which is really great if you're using this data. That's released every 10 years by the Census Bureau. And then in 1981, the first computer file of census data was released, which was great. And that sort of set off the data revolution for what we have today. So I'm going to take a step back, and I want to go over some kind of definitions of gerrymandering. So we talked about this a little bit before, but so gerrymandering in general is manipulating the boundaries of a district to favor one political party, class, or group, also simultaneously diluting the vote of someone else. There are 3 sort of main types of gerrymandering that we often hear about and we talk about, and I'll touch on each of these because I think it's important to understand the types of gerrymandering that exist. And racial gerrymandering, obviously it's justiciable. We've been talking about this for a long time, and it is illegal if you are purposely underrepresenting racial minorities by diluting or minimizing their vote. And so an example of this would be this district in North Carolina. This was overturned by the Supreme Court. This district connected 3 majority African American neighborhoods in 3 different cities hundreds of miles apart across the state, and you can't do that. This essentially packed them into this one district while diluting their vote. They had less representation and in their actual areas. However, it's really important to note that we kind of think about gerrymandering as something like you know it when you see it, but it's not always really the case. And so gerrymandering can sort of technically be legal if you're creating majority-minority districts and you're not otherwise diluting their vote. An example of a district that people kind of think of as being gerrymandered, but technically it passes the test that it is legal, is this what's known as the Earmuff District outside of Chicago in Illinois. This connects two majority Hispanic neighborhoods on the north and south side of Chicago. It's connected at one point by only an interstate. However, this has passed the courts. This is considered a legal district, even though it kind of looks gerrymandered because the vote there isn't otherwise being diluted. And there's a test for that. I won't go into that in detail because I don't really have time, but there's a test to account for racial gerrymandering to prove whether it's legal or illegal, and that's been established by the courts. We kind of mentioned this before, like partisan gerrymandering. Courts have been reluctant to strike down redistricting plans on the basis of political bias. And the Supreme Court has officially ruled in June, of course, that partisan gerrymandering, it's not justiciable, they won't touch it. However, state courts have overturned a lot of gerrymandered plans in North Carolina and Pennsylvania, for example. So how do you measure gerrymandering? Well, you sort of need to understand the criteria. So this is different in every single state. Every state has a different way of a process of redistricting. And there are some common criteria that a lot of states kind of agree on. So compactness, contiguity obviously is an important one. Preserving political subdivisions like municipalities, counties, communities of interest, as well as the cores of prior districts, so it's less confusing for voters. And there's some disagreement about this, but avoiding pairing incumbents. So you sort of know if those criteria are being violated, you can kind of figure out if something is gerrymandered. Fast forwarding a bit to this decade and what set off the kind of revolution that we've had in gerrymandering and the litigation that we've had going on. Some people tried really, really hard to gerrymander, and they were very, very successful. And that kind of came out of what's known as the Redistricting Majority Project, or REDMAP. And so this guy, Tom Hofeller, who was kind of the architect behind this, he traveled around to all these state legislatures and he tried to come up with the most durable gerrymanders possible, and he was pretty successful. And just to kind of show you how kind of like undemocratic this guy is, he actually said this: redistricting is like an election in reverse. It's a great event. Usually the voters get to pick the politicians. In redistricting, the politicians get to pick the voters. That's like so undemocratic, and it's kind of unbelievable. But this was okay, and he went around to states and he tried to get very or implemented very gerrymandered plans. And technology today, we touched on this, like allows for very precise block and even household level targeting and mapping. So there was a bunch of data released from, so Tom Hofeller recently passed away. One of his family members released a bunch of data that he had to the New Yorker, and they wrote a really great article about this. That data hasn't been made public yet. It's still kind of being contested as to whether that's going to be public or not. But just an example of one of the data sets he used to gerrymander. So he had spreadsheets on actual college students in North Carolina, as whether or not they had voter, or whether or not they had the proper ID to vote. And he actually drew the line down the middle of one of North Carolina's historically black colleges in Greensboro, and literally you had dorms on either side of the district boundary, and that's how precise this was, which is pretty insane. However, we've seen that state courts are providing some relief for gerrymandering. The federal courts are reluctant, but state courts, there have been several successful challenges. So North Carolina had their congressional districts overturned as a racial gerrymander. Their state legislative districts were overturned, and there's currently another challenge going on to their state legislative districts. As a matter of fact, one of the successful expert witnesses generated hundreds of sampled plans, redistricting plans, and the legislatures. The court ordered the legislature to pick one of those plans that the expert witness created, and they really weren't sure how to do it, so they actually got a lottery ball machine and decided to just randomly pick one of them. There's a lot more on that if you want to read about it. It's kind of crazy. I guess I want to instill, still don't have a lot of time, I want everyone to take away that they can make a difference. You can, as geographers, we all have the ability to do this kind of work, and it's really important. we were involved in a case for congressional gerrymandering in Pennsylvania, and we made a bunch of maps looking at packing and cracking and jurisdictional splits. So I talked about how that kind of being a common criteria for redistricting. So you can look for cases where you've got certain political classes or groups that are packed into a district and then cracked elsewhere to dilute their vote. You can look at jurisdictional splits, and if you're a geographer and you understand this kind of stuff, you can understand why certain neighborhoods or towns might be split and why others might be packed together. And so we made a bunch of maps. We presented them in court to a federal panel. One of the other things that's been really big lately has been looking at sampling and automated redistricting, and that has been behind a successful challenge in Pennsylvania and North Carolina, where you literally use algorithm known as Markov chain Monte Carlo simulation to generate hundreds or thousands of sampled redistricting plans, and then you essentially plot those out, and you can actually see how the enacted plan, you can see whether it's an outlier compared to these hundreds of sampled plans, and that has been successful in challenging other cases. So if you want to get involved, I highly recommend, again, this is very much a state-by-state process, but Common Cause is one of the national organizations that's working here. They're behind the successful case in North Carolina. In Pennsylvania, I'll just give a shout out for Draw the Lines PA. They are currently using our district builder software, and people are getting involved. Citizens are able to get online. It's a web-based software package where you can actually redraw districts, and we've been submitting plans to the state legislature. And this has been really great. We can actually show the state legislature that everyday citizens and people can do this. We can draw plans that are fairer than the ones that they've drawn. And this effort is behind, the effort behind here is to try to get Pennsylvania to pass a bill to establish an independent commission for redistricting. So some important dates to keep in mind. After the decennial census next year, the redistricting data will be released in April, and that process will begin in every state. So definitely check out what the process is in your state. And then the new congressional districts will, of course, go into effect in 2022. So it's very fast. It happens in less than a year. And yeah, I guess I want everyone to know that geographers, map makers, cartographers, computer scientists, everyone has been part of this. All of these people have been called as expert witnesses, and everyday people, we can really do this. We can analyze plans, draw plans, provide expert witness testimony to try to defeat gerrymandering. So yeah, we have a resources page. I have a bunch of links to other organizations if you want to check them out. We also have our own redistricting website with more information, and I'm happy to talk about this in more detail, and you can contact me as well. Cool.